The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the city skyline. From our townhouse window, I watched the evening settle in, the hum of traffic below mingling with the faint sounds of distant conversation. Normally, this is the kind of calm that brought me peace, but tonight it felt like a weight had taken its place. Catherine, my wife, had left earlier that afternoon for a weekend work retreat. It wasn't the first time she'd gone away for business, but today felt different. Maybe it was the way she kissed my cheek before she left and asked me to keep an eye on Ethan, her nephew. "Mark," she'd said, lingering for a moment, "keep an eye on Ethan while I'm gone. He's still figuring things out, and I don't want him to feel like a guest. Make him feel at home." Ethan, at 19, had been staying with us for a couple of weeks. He just graduated high school and was preparing for college in the city. He showed up at our door with his bag slung over his shoulders, an endearing mix of shyness and gratitude. Catherine insisted we take him in to help him get settled. I didn't mind. Ethan was polite, respectful, and had a quiet charm that made him easy to be around. Still, the house felt different without Catherine there. The dynamic between Ethan and me had always been cordial, but tonight, as the sky faded into twilight and the house settled into its usual evening stillness, something felt off. Maybe it was the absence of Catherine's steady presence, or perhaps it was something I couldn't quite put my finger on. At 7 p.m., I heard the familiar creak of the stairs, and Ethan appeared in the doorway to the living room. His dark hair was slightly tousled, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. He gave me a small smile, his eyes full of warmth. "Hey, Uncle Mark," he greeted, his voice soft but warm. "Catherine told me you'd be here all weekend." "That's right," I said, setting the book I hadn't really been reading aside. "She didn't want you to feel abandoned." He chuckled lightly and settled onto the couch across from me. "She worries too much," he said, but his eyes seemed to say something else. "I'm fine." We fell into a comfortable silence, but I couldn't help noticing how relaxed Ethan looked tonight. His posture was different, more at ease, almost like he was settling into this house, as if it had always been his. It wasn't a bad thing, just different. "You hungry?" I asked after a moment, wanting to break the silence. "Yeah, actually," he admitted. "What's for dinner?" I stood and motioned for him to follow me to the kitchen. "Let's figure that out." We settled on something simple, pasta with a quick homemade sauce. Ethan offered to help, and together we moved around the kitchen, the rhythm of our movements surprisingly natural. His hands were steady as he chopped vegetables with precision, and I stirred the pot on the stove, occasionally throwing in a joke or a story. "You're not bad at this," I said, glancing at him as he expertly diced a tomato. He grinned. "Neither are you. I thought you'd burn water." "Rude." I shot back, but I couldn't help laughing. When the food was ready, we sat down at the dining table. The overhead light cast a warm ambiance over the room, and conversation flowed easily. Ethan talked about his plans for college, his thoughts on the city, and shared a few funny stories about Catherine from when they were younger. He spoke with a quiet confidence that pulled me in, and I found myself hanging on every word. After dinner, we migrated back to the living room. Ethan took his usual spot on the couch, sprawling out comfortably as if the space belonged to him. I returned to my armchair, but my gaze kept drifting back to him. There was an ease about him tonight, something that felt new. "Thanks for dinner," he said after a while, breaking the silence. "It was nice. You didn't have to do all that." "It's no trouble," I replied, smiling. "I enjoyed it." There was another pause, but this one felt heavier. Ethan's eyes met mine, and for a moment it was like the room had shrunk around us. The air was thick, charged with something unspoken but palpable. "I think I'll head to bed soon," he murmured, his voice almost unreadable. He didn't make any move to stand, though. "Yeah," I said softly, but I could feel my heart racing in my chest. I didn't know why I felt so unsettled by his words. Ethan lingered for a moment longer, his gaze flickering over me in a way that felt deliberate. Then, with a small smile, he stretched and stood. "Good night, Uncle Mark." "Good night, Ethan." I watched him retreat up the stairs, the sound of his footsteps slowly fading as he disappeared down the hallway. I sat there for a long time, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Something had shifted tonight, and yet I couldn't put it into words. All I knew was that I wasn't ready to let the night end just yet. The house was quiet now, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of the wooden floors. I stayed in the living room for a while, staring at the flickering light of the fireplace. My thoughts kept circling back to Ethan Heath's quiet smile, the way his eyes had lingered on mine, just a beat too long. There'd been something about him tonight, something I couldn't ignore, even if I couldn't place it. Eventually, I made my way upstairs. My steps were soft on the carpeted stairs, and the hallway was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the nightlight near the guest room. Ethan's door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated as I passed it, the sound of his soft breathing reaching my ears. I shook my head, trying to clear my mind. This was ridiculous. I headed to my bedroom and shut the door behind me, but even as I changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed, my thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. The way he looked tonight, the way his eyes lingered on me in a way that made my pulse quicken. I turned over, staring at the ceiling. My chest felt tight, heavy with a strange mix of emotions I couldn't fully name. Sleep wouldn't come. The stillness of the house was oppressive, the silence loud in my ears. I wasn't sure what compelled me, but after what felt like hours, I found myself slipping out of bed. My bare feet were silent against the floor as I moved down the hallway, guided by some unspoken pull. Ethan's door was still slightly ajar. The faint light from his bedside lamp spilled into the hallway, casting a soft glow. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan?" I called softly, barely above a whisper. There was a rustle of movement from inside, and then his voice, low and warm. "Yeah?" I pushed the door open gently and stepped inside. Ethan was sitting up in bed, the blankets pulled around his waist. His dark hair was tousled and his eyes were heavy with sleep, though still alert. "Can't sleep?" I asked, my voice unsteady. He smiled faintly, his head tilting slightly. "Me neither." For a moment, we just looked at each other. The weight of the silence seemed to fill the room. Then, almost hesitantly, Ethan patted the empty space on the bed beside him. "Do you want to sit?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. I hesitated. Every rational part of me screamed that this was a bad idea, but there was something in his gaze, an openness, a quiet vulnerability, that drew me in. I crossed the room and perched on the edge of the bed, careful to keep a respectable distance. "Is something on your mind?" he asked gently, his tone curious. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know," I said finally. "Just restless, I guess." He nodded, his gaze steady on mine. Me too. The air between us felt heavy again, thick with unspoken words and feelings neither of us had fully acknowledged. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, taking in the sharp angles of his jaw, the curve of his lips. He looked different in the soft light, softer, more vulnerable. "I'm glad you're here," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "It's nice to have someone around, someone who gets it." I turned to him, my brow furrowing slightly. "Gets what?" He shrugged, his eyes dropping to his hands. "What it's like to feel alone, like no one really sees you." The honesty in his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I see you," I said softly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Ethan's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. My breath hitched, and I looked at him, searching his face for some sign of what he was thinking. "Ethan," I began, my voice trembling, but he shook his head, cutting me off. "It's okay," he whispered. I need this. Even if it's just for a moment." I didn't know what to say. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. But as his fingers laced with mine, his touch warm and steady, I found myself leaning into him, the space between us dissolving. His other hand came up to cup my face, his touch gentle but firm. I closed my eyes, and in that moment, the world seemed to fall away. And then his lips were on mine. It was tentative at first, a soft brush of skin against skin. But then the kiss deepened, the heat between us building with each passing second. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer. And I let him. My own hands found their way to his shoulders, and I let myself be lost in the sensation. It felt wrong, I knew that, but at the same time it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. The dim light of early morning filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and I felt disoriented, like I'd just woken from a dream. But there was no mistaking it. Last night it happened. Ethan's touch, his kiss, everything there was no denying it. I turned my head, glancing at the empty space next to me. The sheets were ruffled, but Ethan was gone. A rush of guilt hit me, followed by an unsettling emptiness. How could I have let that happen? This wasn't just some fleeting mistake. It was something else. Something bigger than either of us could have expected. I quickly grabbed my phone and checked the notification. It was from Catherine. A simple text letting me know she'd arrived at her retreat and was getting settled. There was no hint of anything unusual, but I felt a knot form in my stomach. The thought of Catherine coming back to this, to whatever had unfolded between Ethan and me, terrified me. How could I even begin to explain? I slipped out of bed, my legs unsteady as I moved to the window. The city outside was waking up slowly, people going about their routines. A normal day. A day I didn't feel prepared for. I stood there for a long while, just breathing, trying to piece together my thoughts. I had to focus, had to figure out what to do. What was the right thing? I couldn't keep pretending like nothing had happened, but I also didn't know if I was ready to confront Ethan. What would I even say? A soft knock on the door broke my thoughts. I froze, my heart racing again. "Mark?" came Ethan's voice, hesitant. "You up?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah," I called back, my voice thick with nerves. "Come in." Ethan pushed the door open slowly, his face unreadable, his usual calm demeanor replaced with something different, something heavier. He stepped inside, his eyes meeting mine, but neither of us spoke for a moment. It was like the room itself was holding its breath. Ethan began, then stopped, unsure of what he wanted to say. He glanced at the floor before looking back up at me. "I'm sorry." I shook my head, my chest tight. "No, Ethan, I don't know what came over me last night," he said quickly, his voice urgent, almost panicked. "It just felt like everything was building up, and I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't want to make you uncomfortable." I felt a rush of relief, though the guilt still gnawed at me. "You didn't make me uncomfortable," I said quietly, though I couldn't help but wonder if that was true. "But we can't let this happen again. It's wrong." Ethan's eyes flashed with something like regret, but also a sadness that made my stomach twist. "I didn't want to mess things up," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "but I don't know how to fix this." "You don't have to fix anything," I said, trying to steady my breath. "It's just, we need to make sure we don't let this go too far. We can't cross lines like that." There was a pause before Ethan nodded, a faint tremor in his hands as he ran them through his hair. "Right. I don't know what I was thinking." I exhaled, stepping closer to him. "Ethan, it's okay. We just need to move forward and not let it get weird between us." "But it already is weird," he said, his voice small, his eyes searching mine. "I can't pretend like nothing happened." I didn't know what to say to that. The air between us felt thick again, charged, though neither of us moved. Finally, I spoke again, my voice steady. "We have to try, for your sake, for my sake, for Catherine's sake." He nodded again, though his expression was still clouded. I don't want you to hate me." "I don't hate you, Ethan," I replied, my heart aching as I watched him struggle with whatever emotions were battling inside him. "But we need to figure out how to make this right." We stood there in silence for a moment longer, the weight of our words hanging between us. Then, as though on some silent agreement, we both turned away. Ethan left the room first, his footsteps soft against the carpet, and I stayed there, standing still in the middle of the room, overwhelmed with everything that had just happened. The rest of the day passed in a blur. There was a strange tension in the house, but we avoided any further conversation about the night before. Ethan was polite but distant, and I found myself strangely thankful for the small distance. Neither of us seemed ready to confront what had happened, but the undercurrent of unspoken things still lingered, heavy in the space we shared. That night, after a quiet dinner, we both retreated to our respective rooms early. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling once again, replaying the events of the last few days in my head. Everything had changed, but the hardest part was knowing that there was no way to undo it. I tried to focus on the sound of the wind outside, hoping it would lull me to sleep, but the quiet seemed deafening. The house felt empty without Catherine, even though she had only been gone a day. I longed for the normalcy of our routine, the way things had been before. But deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The following morning, I received another message from Catherine. She was coming home early. She had completed the retreat activities and wanted to surprise us. The message was lighthearted, filled with excitement to see us again. But as I read it, the weight of everything seemed to settle deeper into my bones. When she arrived later that afternoon, everything felt off. The way she hugged me, the way she smiled at Ethan, all felt like it was happening in some slow-motion sequence, as if the world around us was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I watched Ethan carefully as he greeted her. He seemed fine on the surface, his usual polite self, but I could see the flicker of something behind his eyes. Was he thinking about last night? Was I? For now, we all played our parts. But I knew this delicate balance wouldn't hold for long. The truth was always waiting to break through, and it was only a matter of time before we'd have to face it. I only hoped that when the time came, we would be ready.